Okay, first of all, good morning to everyone. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate there are lots of other sessions you could have chosen, so it's good that you managed to make your time for this one. My name is Simon Leach. I'm the director of the HPE Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. So this is an internal team that reports into the office of the CSO. So one of our primary roles is to make sure that we work with all of the different business units and global functions within HPE to make sure that they're following our security policies and standards, and that the products that come to market are done in accordance with the appropriate regulations, and that the global functions, as they do their business, do it in a secure way. But what I want to talk about today is around AI. Now, that won't be a surprise, right? I think there's been a number of sessions this week already talking about AI, but I wanted to look at it from a slightly different perspective, which is how we can use AI and combine that with governance and cybersecurity to really allow us to balance the risk and reward. Because with everything we do in business, there is always a risk, and it's up to us to determine how we deal with that risk, whether we can afford to accept that risk, and if we do accept the risk, then how do we mitigate that risk by putting the appropriate controls in place. But before we go into that, forward-looking statements. I don't think I'm covering anything that's roadmap related, but please quickly read all of this through. But before we go into the session, I just wanted to go through the agenda. So I wanted to start off talking a little bit about some of the societal risks around AI and disinformation. So this is much more around AI ethics, but I think it's relevant to set the scene. Then I want to talk about something I call AI inherent risks and AI-enabled threats. And then we'll go into some detail around the strategies that you can use to enable you to balance the risk with the reward of using AI within your businesses. Then at the end, because we're in Europe, a small session on the AI Act and some of the AI ethics, and a little bit at the end about how HPE can help. Now, we do have a microphone for questions. We will have some time at the end to address those questions, so feel free to hold your question until then. But before we go into the detail, I want you all to imagine the scene, right? So you are a financial analyst for a multinational company. It's Friday afternoon, 5 p.m., and you receive an email from your CFO telling you about an important business deal that has to close this week, and that's followed a couple of minutes later by an invitation to a Zoom call asking you to join the CFO and the CIO and a number of important people from your board to discuss this deal. So you think about your cybersecurity awareness training. You think, well, is this real? Is it another attempt at phishing? Is it a scam email? But the language in the email is so good, and the person it comes from, you deal with them on a daily basis. So you decide to take the risk and join the conference call. When you get onto the Zoom call, there's a table, and there are 5 people sitting around the table. There's the CFO, the CIO, a couple of other people. They all look like the people you know. They all sound like the people you know as well. So you get into conversation with them. After the small talk, they tell you that there's an important deal that has to close before the end of business on Friday. And in order for us to do that deal, we need to transfer $25 million to 5 separate accounts in different countries. You're a little bit hesitant, but hey, it's the CFO telling you this, and if the CFO says we should do it, right? Now, you do the transfer, you go home from work, you think nothing about it. Until a week or 2 later, you come into the office, and everyone's in uproar. Hey, there's $25 million missing from our account. Where's it gone? We can't trace it. There's no tracking. There's nothing in our systems that say we should do this. Yeah, that sounds like an unrealistic situation, right? But that's exactly what happened to a financial institute based in Hong Kong. One of their financial analysts was tricked to join a call, and on that call, all of the people on the video were deep fakes. Cyber criminals had used likenesses of people that they had found online to create a very realistic video call that they managed to trick this person into giving away the money. And the challenge we see here, right, is that this goes completely against all we've learned about cybersecurity and cybersecurity awareness. Because video is something we've always trusted in the past, right? But AI has enabled now, with the capacity and the capabilities of AI, has enabled now this new attack vector. And that's something that we're starting to see being identified and understood by a lot of the sort of governmental organizations around the world. And Gabriela Ramos, who's the Assistant Director General within the Social and Human Sciences Department at UNESCO, said last year in a video she put onto YouTube that technologies like artificial intelligence have the potential to empower people and to broaden their perspectives, or they can widen the inequalities and not really contribute to address our social challenges, right? And cybersecurity, or rather cybercriminality and AI, is an example of this widening of the inequality. And secondly, every year the World Economic Forum releases a report, which is their Global Risk Landscape report. And in this year's report in particular, what they do with the report is they go out and they speak to CIOs across the world, and they get an understanding from those CIOs and CEOs of organizations. What are the type of risks that you expect to deal with over the next coming years? And this year, the top short-term risk was around misinformation and disinformation. And you see with this landscape, what they basically do is they have connections between all of the different elements. And the feedback they got from the people they spoke to when they built this report was that misinformation and disinformation, it's the #1 short-term risk. And the reasons for this is basically because of AI, right? So AI having the capability to generate misinformation and disinformation, contributing to cyber insecurity by creating new attack methodologies, and contributing to the adverse outcomes of AI technologies. And this has been particularly relevant this year because over 3 billion people in the world are going to the polls. You know, obviously, we've just seen in the US the elections, but there are elections in a number of other countries as well, including, I believe, India and some of the larger states. So the ability for misinformation and for deep fakes to be used as a way of influencing public opinion is really very realistic. Now, we've all heard Antonio speak yesterday in the keynote. Now, last year, he made a statement which I think is very relevant here, right? Which is that data is the new currency for the digital economy, and the key to extracting value and insights will come from AI. And we've all got experience with this, right? We all use AI in a certain sense or other to further our business outcomes within the organization. But whenever I hear Antonio say this, I think of another parallel, which is this one, right? Willie Sutton was a 1930s bank robber, and when he was arrested after, I believe it was breaking into the federal bank, he said, "Why do I rob banks? Because that's where the money is," right? And that's kind of exactly the same thing we're dealing with here. Why am I going to use AI to break into a company? Because that's how I get to the data. That's how I get to the currency or the money of that organization. Now, actually, in point of fact, this is also an example of misinformation and disinformation, because after this was published, Willie denied actually having said that, and he said, well, the real reason that he robs banks is because he enjoys the thrill of breaking into a building where nobody else can get into. But I think this statement is much more relevant to the discussion. So setting the scene, if we now move into what is the actual problem, right? So when I speak to customers about this, I'm talking about this concept of AI inherent risks versus AI enabled threats. So if we look at each of those individually, the first one, AI enabled threats, right? So AI enabled threats, this basically refers to threats from external actors who are using AI to enhance their cyber attacks. Now, I've already given you one example of that in terms of the deep fakes. So being able to use AI to generate video and sound and to use that to misrepresent somebody. Now, there's been many examples of this, and even in the business space, I know when OpenAI, when they started to introduce voices into their responses, there was a voice called Sky, and Scarlett Johansson, a famous actress, thought that voice was based upon her. And in fact, there was some discussion previously that OpenAI had supposedly reached out to her, and she had said no, and then they still went ahead. OpenAI came out later and said actually it wasn't based upon Scarlett Johansson at all, and they removed the voice. But the point is, the technology is there that allows that to be created. Also from an AI-powered phishing perspective. Now, in the past, when we've done our cybersecurity awareness training with people, we've always said one way to spot a phishing email is to look at the language that's being used, right? Because very often, traditional phishing emails would have spelling mistakes in them, or they'd have bad grammar or bad use of language. And there was a reason for that, right? The reason was that the people that are more likely to spot the errors in the phishing email are going to be less likely to click on the link. Basically, they're looking for gullible people, right? And gullible people are less smart, and therefore they don't notice the spelling errors. Therefore, there's more chance of success of them clicking through on the link. And that was a good way of making people aware of what a phishing email was versus a normal email. But now that the cyber criminals are using AI to create their phishing emails, they can create really, really legitimate-looking emails. And I did an experiment myself with this by creating an AI-powered email. It wasn't a phishing email, but by using the voice of the person I wanted to represent. And it's very easy to do. All you do is you set within your context when you make the request to the AI engine is you say, I want it to sound like this person, and here's an example of how this person speaks. So that particular person had done an online interview, and there was word-for-word quotes being used in that online interview. So I just put the link of that online interview into the request, into the LLM, and it came back with an email that word-for-word looked like that person had written, completely perfect English, didn't have spelling mistakes in it. So it makes it a lot harder for people to identify these AI-powered phishers because they're really, really realistic. We're also seeing AI being used to sort of automate exploitation. So I no longer have to be, hacker behind the keyboard. I can start to use AI tools to go out there and identify the vulnerabilities and exploit those vulnerabilities without me really having to do very much as a hacker at all. And the same thing goes for AI-driven malware. Now, in the past, we've had this idea of polymorphic malware, right? So polymorphic malware is malware that changes to avoid detection by endpoint tools like antivirus tools or endpoint detection and response tools. But that was always done by people. Now we've got AI to do that for us. The cyber criminals can basically be creating polymorphic malware on the fly that has never been seen before, and with the aim of completely avoiding behavioral-based tools. So these are some of the examples of the AI-enabled threats, so how cybercriminals use AI to get better. But we've also got this idea of AI-inherent risks, right? And AI-inherent risks are the risks that we introduce through the deployment and use of AI systems within an organization. And there's a couple of examples here. Some of them are more or less related to cybersecurity, but the first one around accidental disclosure of IP. So there's a couple of sort of examples of this. The first one is based upon the model that you use, the data that you use to train your model. So for example, if you train your model with a bunch of confidential data, then that confidential data is going to be used when the model responds to questions in the inference phase. So it's really important to understand what data you put in to that model. But there are also other examples of where this could happen, because obviously when you put information into your request to an LLM, you need to be very careful about what information is put in there. Now, most models are not using the information from requests to retrain the model, because retraining the model doesn't happen dynamically. But even so, it's not a good idea to put confidential information in there. There was an example of a semiconductor company, I can't remember if it was this year or the end of last year, but they were using an AI-based code analysis tool to look at code, and they put a whole bunch of their internal code into the engine. And of course, that means it's going outside. You don't know where that code goes. The LLM operator may say they're not going to use the information to retrain the model later, but you don't know. So it's very important to get an understanding of that. You've also got the idea of adversarial attacks, and this is more in the space of people basically trying to break the engine. Now, an adversarial attack could happen at the perimeter of your organization. So, for example, capturing inputs and outputs as they go in and out of the model. But it could also happen trying to break the model itself. And one important thing, and we'll discuss this later in the presentation, is about making sure that you don't forget about traditional cybersecurity controls in the AI space. Also, this idea of data poisoning. Now, data poisoning can be used, again, in a number of different ways, but this is really about tricking the model into giving you a different response than is extended. Now, this becomes especially important when we think about the connection between security and safety, right? So an example that is quite often used is if I could trick an autonomous driving car into misunderstanding a stop sign, then that could have a catastrophic effect, right? It could cause crashes, it could cause incidents. But by putting information into the model or poisoning the data in that model, you could potentially do that. Now, most of the autonomous all of the autonomous driving companies have very good controls around that, but it's an example. Another example is where you trick the engine into thinking that actually all of these pictures of cats are dogs. So data poisoning has some concerns there. And then, of course, exfiltration of models and training data. Now, if you're going to set up a large LLM within your organization, in some cases, this can cost tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And that's your intellectual property, the training that you've done to make this model useful for your purpose. You don't want somebody to come in and steal all of that data from the model and steal all of your training data, because effectively you're saving them money, but you're also giving away all of your intellectual property. So when I talk about how we can actually handle the strategies to reduce these impacts, there's really 3 different areas where we've got the opportunity to balance risk and reward, right? So we start off with consuming AI. So how do we use generative AI, for example, to improve our decision making, but yet do that in a secure and governable way? The second is around building AI. So how do we develop in-house models to get better control and also offer better security? And how do we actually use AI as a cybersecurity tool? So use it in the way we protect our organization. So I'd like to spend the next minutes speaking about these 3 use cases. So consuming, building, and protecting with AI. So if we start off with the first one, hopefully all of your organizations has already taken a look at AI governance, right? Because I think this is something that's very important to understand. Whenever you introduce a new technology into your organization, you have to make sure that you can govern the use of that technology. Exactly the same thing happened with public cloud, for example. When public cloud first came out, in order to avoid shadow IT, companies put policies in place that restricted the use of cloud or made the use of clouds easier through proper company processes. And the same needs to happen with AI as well. Now, early, when Gen AI was first released, a lot of organizations kind of said, okay, well, we're just going to block it because it's too much of a risk to our organization. We don't want our users using this because it's going to introduce too much risk to our organization. But in the same way as if you tell your child not to do something, what does that child do? They just want to do it even more, right? And that's exactly what happened with those sort of organizations. Sure, they said you can't use generative AI anymore, but the employees of those teams just went off and found other ways to use Gen AI that wasn't on the corporate laptop. So now, not only are you putting a control in place that nobody wants to follow, but you're introducing the opportunity or the option that data might leak from the company because it's now going on personal laptops and being used for Gen AI from that perspective. So it's important to introduce a governance process around AI. And really this starts when you look at the use cases that the business wants to adopt. And I think the thing with governance is it's not just a cybersecurity thing. So for example, the governance process that we use internally at HPE, it's not just the cybersecurity team that regulates that, but we also involve the privacy team and the legal team and the ethics team, because all of those play a role in whether we should or shouldn't be using AI for a certain purpose. And also to some of the points that Antonio made yesterday in the keynote, a lot of the time, the use cases that are being introduced for Gen AI aren't necessarily valid use cases, right? So a lot of organizations are spending money and getting Gen AI because they think they need it, but after 6 or 12 months, and you ask them, okay, well, what did you get back from using AI? They don't know because they can't measure it. So the first step of a good governance process is to understand the use cases. And once you've done that, you can then start to do threat modeling that allows you to identify the threats. So if I use this platform and share this information with the platform, what is the risk that I'm introducing to the organization? And if you do that threat modeling effectively, you then start to be able to understand the risk tolerance for Gen AI. And your governance process then gives you the opportunity to say yes or no to a particular use case. So for example, using something like ChatGPT or any of the equivalent models out there might be perfectly acceptable for your employees because it introduces great opportunities to get better information and better understanding and better context of particular aspects. But you probably don't want people putting your company information into the model for for the reasons I mentioned on one of the previous slides. So understanding that risk tolerance gives you the yes or no decision. And based upon that, you can then start to introduce a Gen AI policy, introduce a Gen AI governance model, and architect the appropriate compensatory controls that would be required to reduce the risk that that particular aspect of Gen AI is introducing. And this generally works well because then you get to the position where the business can adopt the generative AI technology and they can use it both for internal use cases and integrated use cases. But the important thing is that the governance model allows you to get inputs from all of these different teams so that you fully understand the risk of using Gen AI to support your business. And then over time, you will mature your use cases, you'll refine and enforce your Gen AI policy. You'll also start to be able to monitor for policy exceptions and for non-compliance. And ultimately, you'll be able to enhance both the detective and the protective controls of using Gen AI. So as an example there, an early control may be just policy-based, but then you may start to look at some of your perimeter-based technologies that look at content management and start to put in pop-ups in place that remind people when they're using Gen AI that they need to follow the policy. But as you get further down the line, then you can enhance those controls and maybe provide better options, actually blocking things that have been determined to have too much risk and providing lower controls on things that have an acceptable risk. So putting a governance process in place really becomes important. And this is not just around platforms like ChatGPT or the commercial and open LLMs that are out there, but also other tools that use AI integrated in them. So things like Copilot, it's becoming more and more available in lots of the Microsoft products, and the same with things like GitHub Copilot. Need to make a decision on whether or not it makes sense to integrate that into your workflow. And again, it's a case of balancing up the productivity improvements you'll get by introducing AI into your code development process with the risk that that introduces at either leaking code or potentially, and this is another concern that a lot of organizations have, potentially taking already vulnerable code from the Copilot or from the code generation engine and assuming that it's secure because, hey, it came from AI, it must be good, right? Okay, so that's around the consuming AI aspect. If we then move on to building AI, and this is more where you're looking at building AI models internally. So again, a lot of the stuff that Antonio spoke about yesterday, talking about things like our AI Essentials products and private cloud AI capabilities. This enables our customers to build their own models, either by starting from scratch with their own data sources, or taking a already developed model and then adding retrieval augmented generation or RAG on top of that to provide business-specific capabilities. But the important thing with whatever approach gets taken is that you build the model securely, right? So firstly, consider security at each step of the model lifecycle. In the same way that when we think about software development, we think about security right from the start, hopefully, we should be doing the same thing with model building as well. We need to extend our existing security principles. So just because it's AI doesn't mean we don't still need to think about identity and access management and data security and patch management and security monitoring. Because again, remembering what I said a number of slides back, this is your intellectual property in the model. And that if you start opening up vulnerabilities by not patching things, then an option exists that a hacker could get into the organization and steal that data or steal parts of that model. And then adopt a secure model development framework. And there are a lot of model development frameworks out there. Troj.ai has the SMDLC. Microsoft has introduced something with their secure development lifecycle for AI. We also have an AI risk management framework from NIST, and OpenAI also has some security best practices around machine learning and AI. But by adopting one of these, or at least reading through these and understanding the principles that they're all introducing, it means that when you then start to get to model building, you can take this security-first approach with model building. And if you look at some of the regulations that are coming in place, particularly the EU AI Act, that's one of the requirements there, right, is that the model must be built with security by design at heart. So if we look at these models, and I've taken Troj.ai's model because to me, I think that's both covers the most aspects of it, but also is most closely related to sort of a traditional SDLC or secure SDLC model. It has a number of phases, right? So the first phase, and this is the non-security aspect, but the first phase is you identify your problem and you start to build a design that will address that problem. Once you've done that, you determine what data is going to be used in that model. You train the model and you tune the model so it performs the purpose that you need it to perform. You evaluate the model, and then ultimately you put it into production and you provide continuous monitoring on that model. But what they do with the SMDLC model is they actually add security to each of those phases as well. So at the first phase, it's about doing the risk survey. So it's that threat analysis, understanding what are the threats or the risks that are going to be introduced by implementing AI for this particular business purpose that you're trying to solve. At the second stage, it's about data security. And here, data security isn't just about encrypting the data, but it's understanding what data goes into that model. So as an example, do I want to use internal data to train a model that's going to be used by customers? Probably not. But it's also about having the right data in there as well to reduce things like hallucinations and misunderstandings, and keeping that data specific, especially when you think about the amount it costs to train models. It's of no relevance at all to have football scores, for example, in a model that's going to be used for legal perspectives. Then at the model training and tuning phase, the model security is important there. Now that goes back to a lot of the traditional controls that we need to have in place, making sure that the way we've deployed or the way we're planning to deploy that model has been done accurately, and that only the appropriate people can access the information that they're entitled to access. So it's not only about identity and access management, but it's also about role-based access control to understand who accesses what. Then at the evaluation stage, that's where we introduce inference security, and I'll cover that in the next couple of slides, but basically guardrails, and I'll talk about what guardrails are as we go on. And then as we deploy it, make sure that we've got not only ongoing monitoring, so it's important to be able to consolidate alerts coming out of the AI models into your existing SOC, so you've got that context of both what's happening in the enterprise environment and also the cloud environment, but also the AI environment, but also that you regularly perform security assessments as part of your ongoing risk-based assessments for your organization. So building the models and doing that in a secure manner is going to be a really critical part of adopting all of those technologies that Antonio spoke about yesterday that we're making available to our customers. But if we look a little bit more at the inference stage, so this is really where we talk about guardrails, right? So to put a guardrail into perspective, a guardrail is effectively to AI what a network firewall is to network security, right? So with a network firewall, what we're doing is we're basically looking at traffic as it comes in and out of a network segment, and we're determining, okay, this traffic is into an internal web server, and that's permitted, or this traffic uses a port that it shouldn't be using, so that's blocked. Now, AI guardrails are a very similar concept. So the AI guardrails are basically intended to assess both the inputs and the responses that are coming into or going out of an AI model. And by doing that, It allows us to deal both from an ethical perspective, but also to protect attacks, to protect data privacy, to provide compliance with policy and regulations, to introduce model safety, to give us the option to moderate content, and also to audit what's happening going in and out. And if we think about why that's important, we wouldn't want people, and this goes back to model data exfiltration that I mentioned in one of the threats. We don't want potential hackers to be querying our model and getting data out of the model that shouldn't be coming out. So as an example, I'm not sure how many of you have seen Antonio Nearly, which is the digital avatar of Antonio that's on the show floor. But you can ask Antonio questions in language, in natural language, and he will respond in natural language with responses. Now, if you try asking him the question, okay, Antonio, how much do you earn? He's going to respond, and he's going to say, I'm sorry, as a digital avatar, I'm not authorized to give you confidential HPE information. That's an example of using a guardrail, right? It's about restricting what the model gives you back. But at the same time, a guardrail could also be used, for example, for things like creating exploit code. There are engines out there that you can just ask it a question like, create me some proof of concept exploit code for this particular vulnerability, and it will go ahead and do so. Guardrails allow you to reduce those kind of things as well, because when you're using guardrails for that purpose, they'll actually analyze the requests to make sure there's nothing going wrong, and they'll also analyze the responses to make sure that nothing is going wrong. So those guardrails sort of look at it in a bit more detail. What they're really aiming to do is to address the risks. So if we look at some of those risks, and we've spoken about some of these already, but the bad actor can introduce risks into our model environment through things like data injection and prompt injection against the LLM services. They can misdirect requests to the LLM gateway, or they can pollute the responses coming out of that gateway. They can also capture prompts. They can jailbreak or manipulate prompts. They can cause hallucinations, and they can leak or exchange capture information. So what we can do with guardrails is introduce controls that reduce all of those risks, right? So, for example, looking at the prompt input, this helps us with our governance model. What can people ask? Ideally, every time somebody asks a bad question, I'd stop that bad question immediately in the first guardrail. But there's also the option that the response comes back. So one of the things I've noticed with LLMs is that you can ask a question in one way, and it will say, no, I'm not going to answer that. But then you can slightly adjust the question, and you can trick the engine into giving you a response. So you also have the same filtering happening from a governance model perspective on the responses. So even if somebody gets by the input guardrail, they get stopped by the output guardrail on the way back out again. Also, in terms of model permission schemas, the guardrails can be used to make sure it's the right people accessing the information, and they can be used to validate the accuracy and providing contextual warning as the information comes out. And they can also validate the response source. And that becomes critical, especially when you look at how you would integrate guardrails into a RAG flow. So basically, RAG is a way of integrating third-party data sources into your AI model, right? So RAG is response augmented generation. Basically, when you train your model, you'll train your model based upon your data, and then the inferencing process will take your request and it will transform that into something that the model understands, and it will augment that with additional information that it gets from third-party sources. And that's why LLMs today, they're becoming much more relevant with more current events, because they don't rely on the information that's in the model on the model creation date, but they can start to add additional information to that. Now, the RAG can be performed by integrating with external sources, but the RAG can also be used by integrating with additional internal resources. So again, for example, in a situation where you've built up a model based upon company data, and obviously that company data changes over time, then you use RAG to be able to get access to some of that updated data. And the typical flow that we would see here from a guardrail perspective is that the initial question comes in. That question is handled by an open source tool, LangChain. It goes out and it's checked against our policy to see if that policy is acceptable. So that's an example of the AI governance guardrail. It then comes back in and it gets turned into a vector that gets handled by the vector DB. So basically putting it into effectively ones and zeros that the engine will understand. The vector DB pulls out the top K or the top however many particular text or facts that you want to understand in your response. And then the prompt gets passed to the data engine, it gets augmented with the appropriate data, and it gets provided back to the user via the front-end application. And by putting guardrails in place at each of those steps, you can make sure that you follow your policies, and you also don't introduce non-compliant requests and responses into the example. And typically, that will be done in combination with a small language model. And that small language model is where you have the context about what is or isn't allowed. So then if we move on to the third part, so we've covered consuming AI, we've covered building AI. The next is protecting with AI, right? And protecting with AI is where we start to think about how AI can be used as a tool to enhance our cybersecurity capabilities within an organization. And there's a lot of areas that we're starting to see being very promising here. In fact, only yesterday, so Google has a project running which is called Deep Sleep. So Deep Sleep is basically an LLM that they've developed that they're using to identify vulnerabilities in an automatic fashion. And already a month or so ago, they provided a report on their first results from this, but only yesterday they've extended this and they've now found a vulnerability in the SSL libraries that has been there for 20 years. And in 20 years of security experts looking at the code over and over again, nobody has ever found this vulnerability. But by using AI and the additional context that AI can bring to that, they've been able to identify this quite important vulnerability that without AI would not have been detected. So that's from a vulnerability discovery perspective, but you can also start to use AI from a vulnerability analysis perspective to give you much better insights in the type of vulnerabilities that you're identifying with a traditional vulnerability scanner. Because if any of you are responsible for your vulnerability management programs within your organization, you'll know that there's always a huge number of vulnerabilities and you can't keep up with patching them all. So by providing AI context there to actually understand the machines that the vulnerabilities exist on and understand the business purposes and also understand the actual chance that somebody has of exploiting that vulnerability, you can get much better data-driven analysis about where the problems exist for your organization. We're also starting to see AI being used a lot from a threat detection and prevention perspective, and I think it's important to point out here that marketing organizations always like to jump on the latest bandwagon, right? So every cybersecurity team at the moment is talking about how AI fixes or how AI improves their product. I think it's important to take that within the context that it's provided, right? So a lot of the time, the AI capabilities are more machine learning capabilities. Where AI will really start to help us with threat detection and response is when we have completely autonomous systems that are able to identify threats, take the appropriate actions to remove the threat actors, and remediate the problems. Now, the challenge we have there at the moment is one of trust, right? So it wouldn't be a very long-lived project if the first thing that the AI automated security tool blocked was the CEO's laptop. Right? So we still need to go a little bit further before we're in the position where threat detection and prevention is going to be something that's really completely autonomous. And I think to put that into context, if we think about how AI is evolving, we've got three different levels. We've got artificial narrow intelligence, which is where the AI has a very specific purpose. We have artificial general intelligence, where AI has a purpose, but it's able to expand that purpose into lots of different contexts. And then we have artificial superintelligence, which is really where AI becomes this self-thinking thing, and that's kind of where autonomous driving wants to get to. At the moment, artificial general intelligence, if you sort of put it in the terms of human development, right, we're probably around about a 10-year-old child. So, 10-year-olds, they can be very good at some subjects at school, but typically they don't have the global context and the context that comes with many years of living to be able to make all of the decisions. They may get an A in maths every time, but there are other areas where they're a little bit less in. We really need to get AGI to the level where it's about a 35-year-old, and at that point, then we'll start being able to see where AI can fully automate cybersecurity capabilities. But I think where we're really seeing the value from AI at the moment is around analyst support. And one comment to kind of make here is that there's a lot of talk in the market, right, about how AI is going to replace people's jobs. And from a cybersecurity perspective, the way I always position that is that you won't lose your job to AI, but you will lose your job to somebody who knows how to use AI, right? So particularly from an analyst perspective, we're already doing this internally, right? Is that our cybersecurity analysts, they see hundreds or thousands of alerts that they have to analyze all the time, and AI can provide them additional context about those alerts. So for example, okay, we're seeing this alert on this particular system. Well, we've seen something similar in the past, and this is how we dealt with it in that situation. Or we've seen this situation, we know the attacker is coming from here, and here's some information about that attacker that you can use in your report. So in terms of supporting our analysts to be able to deal with alerts much faster is a real value that we're already starting to explore. And there are lots of tools out there, open source tools that you can use that will allow you to build that as a proof of concept internally, and that then becomes an ideal use as we go down for things like the private cloud AI platform and using models such as Llama and Phi on top of those platforms to be able to build the context that you need to get the context around security alerts. And then the real benefit becomes when you start to use retrieval augmented generation to bring both the base models and the internal subject matter expertise that you have together so that you get real context-based analyst support. Another area where I've started to use AI myself is around tabletop exercises as well. So tabletop exercises, if you do those on a regular basis, they tend to be quite expensive because typically you'll bring an external party in to create the scenario for you and to build the context, and then it will take place over a number of days, and you'll basically simulate an incident. And these work very well, and they're certainly very relevant to organizations today. But typically, because they're expensive, only a select group of people get involved in them. But what I've used AI for in this sense is as a training tool. So you can put a context into an LLM, something along the lines of, I am the CISO for this particular organization, and we suffered a breach on this date. You are the SOC lead analyst, and I would like you to support me as we go through a tabletop exercise. I'm going to ask you questions. Please provide me answers, but don't go overboard on the responses. And then by doing that, you can actually have an interactive session with the LLM. And if you base that on a real incident, then all of that incident information is already on the web. So the engine goes out there and it knows all of the details of that incident. So when you ask it questions like, okay, what is the impact of the attack so far? The engine will come back and it'll say, well, at the moment it's impacted 10,000 servers and 50% of our estate is offline. Okay, what actions have you taken so far? Well, so far I've managed to segment the network and do this and do that. And then the engine will actually lead you through that process. So now it costs you no money at all to do a tabletop exercise, or at least get the understanding of how tabletop exercises work for people within the team that don't always get the access to the tabletop experiences. And it's a great learning tool from that perspective. So there's a lot of things we can do with AI for cybersecurity that don't have to cost us money, but certainly as we go through time, we're going to see a lot more opportunities of how we can use AI to really start to help us predict, protect, and prevent attacks. A couple of slides here on the AI Act. So I think if we look at cybersecurity in general, right, when people, everybody understands that cybersecurity is important, and everybody wants to play their role in making sure organizations are secure. Now, governments, the only real role they can play there is through regulation. And especially in the EU, we've seen that recently. We've got things like NIS2, we've got DORA for the financial industry, and we've got the EU AI Act. And the EU AI Act entered into force in August, and it's built around a risk-based framework. So they basically have 3 definitions of AI models. And depending upon which definition you have for your model, you will have to apply more or less governance and cybersecurity controls over that model. So they have this idea of unacceptable risks. So these are basically models that will not be allowed. Things like cognitive behavioral manipulation or social scoring or real-time biometric identification. They don't want those in the models in the EU. Now, there are some exceptions to that. So, for example, real-time identification, some of the police authorities are able to use that with certain time delays, etc. You've also got the high-risk models, and these are products that generally get covered already by EU product safety legislation. So things like autonomous driving or using AI with aviation or for medical diagnosis purposes, and these will be registered in an EU database. And then there's limited risk, which is has some requirements, but it's basically all the other models. Now, a lot of the cybersecurity tools that we'll be using will be in the high-risk space because of the information they're dealing with. And the main requirement from a cybersecurity perspective there is that they have to follow this secure by design approach. So again, that brings relevance back to the building with AI section that I spoke about earlier when we spoke about the secure model development lifecycle, and all of the steps that that introduces becomes very relevant when we talk about introducing models under the EU AI Act as well. And organizations within the EU will be expected to be following those requirements and introducing things like secure data handling and risk management and testing and continuous monitoring as they build their own models. Now, Antonio has said artificial intelligence holds enormous potential to advance the way people live and work, but we also have to ensure that we apply these powerful tools both ethically and sustainably. And that really goes in line with the EU AI Act as well. And HPE was very early in this space. 5 years ago, we introduced our AI Ethics for Good. And this talks about AI privacy-enabled security and the AI human focus principle and the inclusivity principle and the robust principle, and also that AI is used responsible. So basically that it's as transparent as possible and that it protects people and it has a human-focused approach. And all of that becomes very relevant when we look at things like the EU AI Act. And it's, I think, very important that we as a company are supporting that approach. So to talk a little bit about how HPE can help in this space, obviously there's a lot of knowledge within HPE about AI, but in terms of AI cybersecurity, then that's mostly in the realm of our advisory and professional services cybersecurity function. And they offer a number of capabilities. The first one is around an AI transformation workshop for security. So this is a sort of one-day whiteboard-based workshop where they will work with the customers or with our customers to identify or to understand the business use and then to start to identify the key security risks and the use cases for AI and ML. And by going through that exercise, if you think about it from in terms of the threat modeling that I discussed earlier in the model development lifecycle capability, it will help you to get an understanding of where the potential problems could exist by speaking with consultants who have done this for many customers in the past. But additionally, we also have the AI ML-powered cybersecurity solution, which is actually on this slide. And that is a platform that we've developed in conjunction with NVIDIA that uses the NVIDIA Morpheus model for cybersecurity. So this is different to the HPE Morpheus platform, which is about cloud orchestration. NVIDIA Morpheus is basically a GPU-enabled end-to-end framework for AI. I said GPU accelerated. And then the Triton inference server for taking the responses and the requests. And that's all based upon HPE hardware, obviously with NVIDIA GPUs. This provides an integrated solution that we can use for getting the data into the platform, and then using NVIDIA Morpheus, we can actually create the use cases. So for example, using this for monitoring sensitive information detection or email data loss prevention, or in terms of next-gen log analytics, design implementation, next-gen security operations center, design and implementation, because we're going to start to see more and more of our customers looking for how they can use AI to enhance the capabilities that they have within security operations centers. And a lot of this stuff has to start from a POC phase, right? There's not just a product you can pull off the shelf and install. It's going to be a joint approach in determining the use cases, understanding how AI helps, and then integrating AI into those workflows. So with that to conclude, organizations that harness AI will step ahead of those that ignore its potential. I think that's pretty clear for everyone, right? AI gives us the opportunity to change the way we secure our enterprises when we look at using AI as a tool to help us protect our organizations. But in order for that to work, we also need to make sure we adopt AI in a secure and an ethical way. And HPE can help you there, both through delivering trustworthy AI by following our AI ethical principles, but also with the services and capabilities that the advisory and professional services cybersecurity function can offer. Thank you.